Morning light came in wrong. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the unfamiliar ceiling fan spinning slow and lazy above her head. Not the smell of cedar and something clean, like a bar of soap left out too long. Not even the weight of the silence, thick and particular, the kind that only lived in houses that weren't her own. It was the light. Where it fell. The angle of it across her bare arm. She always woke facing east in her apartment. She was facing south now. Gabrielle Okafor sat up slowly, as if too fast would confirm something she wasn't ready to face. The room was simple. A dark wood dresser. A chair with a flannel shirt folded neatly across the arm. A window with thin curtains. And she was in a bed that was not her bed, in a room that was not her room, on the morning she was supposed to become someone's wife. Her phone was dead. Her shoes were by the door. Her dress, that white beaded thing that had taken 6 months to find, was nowhere in the room. She pressed her palm flat against the unfamiliar sheets. Breathed once. Breathed again. There was the sound of coffee being made somewhere down a hall. Stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't what you'd expect. And everything that led to it, every choice, every fear, every carefully constructed wall she'd ever built around herself, matters more than the moment itself. Gabrielle Okafor grew up the only daughter of Dr. Constance Okafor and her husband Leonard, a real estate attorney who'd made quiet, patient money for 30 years in Raleigh, North Carolina. She did not grow up in a mansion. Her parents were the kind of wealthy that wore itself like a comfortable old coat, understated, present, never announced. The Okafor home was in a neighborhood where the lawns were maintained by professionals and the cars in the driveways were sensible but new. She had her own bathroom by the age of 9. She learned to appreciate this without being told. What Gabrielle knew about herself by 31 was this: she was careful. She was methodical. She kept her personal life behind a specific and well-maintained distance from almost everyone. She worked as a hospital administrator at Pines Regional Medical Center in the fictional small city of Clover Creek, Mississippi, a place she'd moved to 7 years ago for a position that became a career that became an identity. She was good at her job the way some people are good at chess, not because she loved it, but because she understood the board. The 2 relationships she'd had before Marcus were not secrets she hid. They were simply details she didn't volunteer. The first was Daniel. An architect from Charlotte who called her gorgeous and meant it, but also spent 8 months telling her in small and creative ways that she expected too much, needed too much, was too much. She didn't cry when it ended. She cleaned her apartment instead, top to bottom, and went to bed with the satisfaction of a woman who had recognized something too late but recognized it nonetheless. The second was Terrence. Terrence was the one that marked her. He was generous and funny, and she fell for him the way you fall on ice, fast, helpless, embarrassed. 3 months in, she found texts. Not a single indiscretion. A whole parallel life. He'd been dating someone else the entire time, a woman in Jackson who thought they were serious. Gabrielle didn't confront him. She sent him a single text, "I know." Then she blocked every account he'd ever touched and didn't speak of it again. What she told herself after Terrence was that she would simply be smarter. She would pay attention differently. Watch what people did when they thought she wasn't looking. Test the gaps between what a man claimed to be and what he was when things got inconvenient. She didn't think of herself as cynical. She thought of herself as educated. She moved through Clover Creek like a woman with a pleasant face and a closed door. Dinner alone on Tuesdays. Church with her colleague Diane on Sundays. A small circle of friends she loved genuinely but from a horizontal distance, like looking at a painting you admired but weren't sure you deserved to touch. She told herself she was content. On most days, she almost believed it. Marcus Webb had been in Clover Creek for 3 years before Gabrielle ever noticed him, which said something about the invisible architecture of class, how certain people could move through the same spaces and never quite share the same air. He was from Tupelo originally, the youngest of 4. His mother Shirley cleaned houses 3 days a week and bagged groceries the other 2. His father had been gone since Marcus was 11, not dramatically, no scene, no note, just gone, the way water disappears from a cracked cup. Marcus did not speak about this with either bitterness or relief. It was simply a fact of the landscape of his growing up, the way the highway noise was a fact, or the leaky kitchen faucet, or the way certain shoes had to last 2 school years whether they fit by May or not. He worked in property maintenance, which in Clover Creek meant he handled building upkeep for several commercial properties including, as of 18 months ago, Pines Regional Medical Center. He was good at the work in the way of people who respected things, who wiped down a surface after fixing it, who noted a second problem they hadn't been asked to solve and left a written note about it anyway. He drove a silver pickup truck that had seen better years. He ate his lunch outside when weather allowed, sitting on a parking barrier with a sandwich he'd made himself, reading a paperback. Always a paperback. He navigated spaces where he felt watched with a specific kind of stillness. Not shrinking. Not performing. He simply existed in those spaces with a low center of gravity, unhurried, aware. When staff members at the hospital nodded without speaking, he nodded back without requiring anything more. When one of the doctors spoke to him sharply about a repair that disrupted a hallway, Marcus said yes sir in a tone that carried nothing unkind and nothing deferential either. Just clear. It was a tone he'd developed over years, not as armor, but as fact. He knew what he was. That was enough. The small virtues were harder to see if you weren't watching. He brought his own bags to the grocery store before it was common. If he borrowed a thing, he returned it cleaner than he'd taken it. He never asked for credit for something that was simply the right thing to do. And once, a Tuesday in March when he found a woman's wallet near the parking structure with $400 in cash inside, he walked it directly to the security desk without removing anything. He didn't tell anyone. It was not a story he carried around. He'd noticed Gabrielle in the way you noticed a closed window on a warm day, with a quiet curiosity, nothing urgent. She walked the corridors of Pines Regional like a woman who had decided exactly how fast she moved and wasn't interested in renegotiating. He respected that, in the way he respected most things that were clear about themselves. It started with a book. She'd left it on the bench outside the east entrance, a novel she'd been nursing for 3 weeks, Toni Morrison Sula, paperbacked, cover soft with handling. She realized it was gone halfway through the afternoon and retraced her steps, already half resigned to losing it. Marcus was sitting on the same bench during his afternoon break when she came back, the book in his hand, about 40 pages from the back. He looked up. Held it out. Left this. She looked at the book, then at him. You're almost done with it. I've read it before, he said. Just visiting. Something in the phrasing caught her. She reached for the book but didn't quite take it yet. You like Morrison? I like what she does with time, he said. How she doesn't explain things. Gabrielle stood there a beat too long. She took the book. That was all. She said thank you. He nodded and looked back out at the parking lot. She went inside. And she stood at the elevator for an extra moment she couldn't fully account for, the worn cover of the book against her palm, turning over what he'd said about time. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't ask. But she went home and finished the book that night, which she hadn't done for a book in years, and in the morning she thought about what he'd said, how Morrison didn't explain things, and she thought, neither does life, and that's the whole point. She went back to the bench at the same time the following afternoon. He was there. She sat down at the opposite end. The weeks that followed were not romantic in any conventional sense. They were something quieter and stranger than that. They talked, when they talked, about books mostly, and then about the town, and then about small ordinary things, the way the summer had held too long this year, an unremarkable debate about whether the diner on Linden was still worth the drive, a moment when they'd both witnessed the same particular flock of starlings turning over the west parking lot and turned to look at each other at the exact same moment without planning to. He didn't try to impress her. This was the thing she noticed first, and then kept noticing, like a door that should have made a sound when it opened but didn't. Most men, in Gabrielle's experience, performed something near her. They pitched themselves. Marcus Webb seemed to have no pitch. He came to the bench, read or didn't read, said what he thought when she asked, listened without nodding aggressively to prove he was listening. He remembered that she took her coffee without sugar, not because he made a show of it, but because the third time she mentioned getting coffee, he already knew. She began to lower something, not fully, not yet, but something. A small portion of the weight she carried behind her sternum all the time. He, for his part, stayed exactly who he was. One afternoon he fixed a loose gutter near the hospital entrance on his own time because he'd noticed it pulling away from the fascia and knew it would be a problem by October. He didn't mention it to her. She only found out because maintenance supervisor Caleb mentioned it offhandedly in a corridor. She stored this the way she stored all things she wasn't sure what to do with yet, in a place behind the place where she made her daily decisions. They went to the diner on Linden once, officially, the kind of once that announced itself as something. She paid for her own meal before he had the chance to reach for the check. He did not make anything of this. That, too, she noted. Friends, let me ask you something, and I want you really to think about it. Have you ever been afraid of someone's goodness? Not because they were pretending, but because you weren't sure you knew what to do with it if it was real? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me what you did. Because that question is exactly where Gabrielle found herself, and it's about to change everything. It was the middle of August when the fear came back. Not as a dramatic event. As a temperature shift. She'd been at his truck after work, just talking, leaning against the passenger side door the way people do when they're comfortable somewhere they haven't admitted they're comfortable yet. He'd said something funny about the parking lot security camera, pointing at it, and she'd laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprised her from the back of her throat. And right behind the laugh, without announcement, came the thought, I don't actually know what he does when I'm not here. She drove home and the thought followed her. She began to revisit what she knew about him. Which, when she examined it, was mostly what she'd been allowed to see. He showed up. He was kind. He was consistent. But consistency was also a thing that could be performed, wasn't it? Terrence had been consistent. Terrence had been, to all visible appearances, a loving and present man. Right up until he wasn't. She started noticing things she had previously allowed to pass without commentary. He'd mentioned a woman named Deja once, just briefly, an old friend from Tupelo. He hadn't explained who Deja was or isn't. Gabrielle had not asked. Now the not asking felt like a failure of diligence. She watched how he talked to other women at the hospital. Professional. Friendly. Appropriate. Too appropriate? She hated the thought even as it formed. But she'd learned, hadn't she learned, that the version of a man you saw in public was the performance, and the private version was the truth. She sat with this for a week and did not mention it to him. But something shifted in the temperature of her presence. And Marcus, who had a quiet sensitivity to atmosphere, felt it without being able to name it. She had a friend named Keisha who worked as an event coordinator and owed Gabrielle a favor that was long overdue. Gabrielle called in the favor in September. The setup was this: Keisha would approach Marcus separately, not as Gabrielle's friend, presenting herself as a woman he'd never met, and in the course of conversation, offer what appeared to be an opportunity. Keisha was attractive, quick, disarming. The proposition would be framed as a potential date, casual, nothing dramatic. Just an offer, hanging in the air. What would he do with it? The evening Keisha made her approach was a Thursday. Gabrielle did not watch directly. She sat in her car across the lot with the window cracked, her hands very still in her lap, feeling like a woman she wasn't sure she recognized, doing a thing she wasn't sure she could justify, because the alternative, the possibility of being wrong again, of being that woman again, hollow and carefully composed at the end of a thing she'd trusted, felt unsurvivable. Keisha was good. She leaned against the truck bed, smiled slow, mentioned a place she'd been thinking of trying. Left the door open. Marcus was polite. Warm even, in the way that was just his natural register. And then he said, simply and without drama, that he was seeing someone. Didn't perform it. Didn't make Keisha feel the weight of the rejection. Just seeing someone. Like it was just the fact that it was. He mentioned Gabrielle's name without being asked. Keisha excused herself. Walked to her own car. Texted Gabrielle 2 words, "He's good." Gabrielle read the text in the parking lot. She felt relief and then, immediately behind it, something worse. She didn't know what to do with the relief, so she did nothing. Which meant the next few days looked like this. She was distant in a way she couldn't entirely disguise, and Marcus, who had no information, who didn't know what had happened or why she turned 3 degrees cooler, started to wonder if he'd done something, missed something, been something wrong in a way he couldn't identify. On the 4th day he texted her, "You okay?" She said, "Fine. Busy week." He sent a simple, "Okay." That was it. No pressure. No wounded follow-up. No performance of hurt to make her feel the weight of her silence. And that response, that quiet and unchallenging "okay," should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like an indictment, because it was exactly what a good man would say, which meant she was doing something a good person wouldn't do. She went to church with Diane that Sunday and sat through the whole service without absorbing a single word of it. She drove home and stood in the kitchen for a while with no particular purpose. She pulled out the copy of Sula from the shelf where she kept it now and turned it over in her hands for a long moment. The worn cover. His words about Morrison and time and not explaining things. She thought about what she was doing and what it said about who she'd become. It was Keisha who told her. Not the full truth. Keisha didn't know the full story of what she'd participated in. But she mentioned, in a passing conversation over coffee 4 days later, that she'd heard through the mutual field of Clover Creek social geography that Marcus Webb had been quietly covering the rent for his former neighbor, a woman in her late 60s named Miss Clara, who'd lost her fixed income 2 years ago and had no family local enough to help. No announcement. No fundraiser. Just, he knew, and so he helped. Keisha mentioned it casually, as a small-town detail. She didn't know she was handing Gabrielle a mirror. Gabrielle set down her coffee cup very carefully. She thought of the $400 wallet. She thought of the gutter he fixed on his own time. She thought of his paperback and the way he'd spoken about Morrison and time. She thought of Keisha's text, "He's good." She thought of his okay and what it had cost him to say it that way. She sat very still. Her hands on the table surface, unmoving. Outside the coffee shop window, Clover Creek moved through its ordinary afternoon. She had set a trap for a man who had done nothing to earn one. Her breathing was slow and deliberate. She looked at nothing. She understood something about herself that she did not like. She drove to where he was working that evening, a commercial building on the far side of town he'd mentioned needing to address the week prior. She found his truck in the side lot. She sat in her car for a few minutes. Then she got out. He was on a ladder when she came around the building's side. He looked down, registered her presence without alarm, came down the ladder with a careful, unhurried ease. She said, "I need to tell you something." He wiped his hands on a rag. Waited. "I've been pulling away," she said. "These past few days. And it wasn't because of anything you did." "I figured," he said. She looked at him. "You figured?" "Something changed," he said simply. "Didn't know what." "Was waiting to see if you'd tell me or not." The straightforwardness of it, the utter lack of grievance, made her throat tighten. She said, "I have a pattern of people letting me down. And I realized I'd been watching you for the thing that would confirm you were another version of that. I was waiting for it. Looking for it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He leaned against the truck and looked across the empty lot. "You know what that does to a person," he said finally, "being watched like that? Like they're a suspect?" He said it without heat. He said it the way he said most things, with the calm of someone who had the luxury of being honest because they'd stopped pretending a long time ago. "I've been in spaces my whole life where people looked at me like they were waiting for me to confirm something. Thought it might be different here." She absorbed that. "It was different," she said. "That's the truth. And she stopped. started again. I turned the lens on you anyway. Because I didn't know how to trust what I was feeling. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you feeling? He asked. She said, that I don't want to go backward. That somewhere along the way this became something I'm not willing to lose. He was quiet again. Then, I appreciate you telling me. I'm not walking away. He said it without making her feel it was a concession. Like it was simply also a fact, the same way everything he said was simply a fact. But I need you to decide. Not halfway. All the way in, or we're just protecting yourself together, and that's not what I'm looking for. She nodded. Her eyes didn't move from his. I know, she said. I know that. 3 weeks later, Gabrielle's mother Constance came down from Raleigh for a weekend visit. This was not incidental. Constance Okafor was a woman who had the gift of clarity about other people. She saw through performances and presentations the way some people see through glass. She was also a woman who loved her daughter with a specificity that occasionally expressed itself as interrogation. She met Marcus on the second evening, over a dinner Gabrielle had cooked at her apartment. Constance was gracious and warm and absolutely paying attention to everything. She waited until Gabrielle was in the kitchen before she turned to Marcus and said, not unkindly but not gently either, what is it that you're after with my daughter? Marcus set down his glass. He didn't look for the diplomatic version of an answer. He said, I'm not after anything. I'm just present. Which I'll keep being. Constance studied him. Gabby's been hurt before. Careful. Guarded. I know, Marcus said. How do I know you're worth her trouble? He considered this genuinely. You probably don't know yet, he said. I don't think I can hand that to you. I think it takes time, and you're just going to have to watch for a while. He paused. Same as she did. Constance looked at him for a long moment with her careful, intelligent eyes. Then she picked up her own glass. All right, she said. When Gabrielle came back to the table, nothing about the room's surface had changed. But something in the air was different. She looked between her mother and Marcus. Constance caught her eye and gave her one small nod, barely perceptible, utterly definitive. It was the highest approval her mother ever gave, and almost no one knew how to read it. Gabrielle did. She told him 3 weeks later. They were on the bench outside the hospital, the east entrance bench where it had all started, the same bench, the same October light angling off the building glass. She had the copy of Sule in her hands. She hadn't planned to bring it. Her hands had simply picked it up. I have to tell you something, she said. About 2 months ago. He waited. She told him about Keisha. All of it. The setup, the decision, what she'd been hoping to confirm and what she'd gotten instead. When she finished, the silence between them sat for a moment, neither of them moving. So Keisha wasn't actually interested, he said. No. He looked at the book in her hands. He looked at her. You trusted me enough to try to find out, he said slowly. That's not nothing. She had not framed it that way. She had not allowed herself to. That's generous, she said. Maybe, he said. Or maybe it's just true. He looked at the book again. The worn cover. Morrison doesn't explain things, he said. But she trusts that the reader can find them anyway. He reached over and touched the spine of the book, just briefly. I think you were trying to find something you didn't know how to ask for directly. I can understand that. She looked at him. I'm asking directly now, she said. I'm all the way in. If you still want that. He nodded once. He did. The hospital had a small courtyard garden behind the east wing, mostly ornamental, maintained by a volunteer who was 82 years old and occasionally showed up to work in a hat that had seen better decades. The garden had been, for several years, a small embarrassment to the grounds overgrown in patches, the brick path cracked along the center, a bench that wobbled. Marcus offered to restore it. Not as a grand gesture. He simply mentioned it to the facilities committee one Tuesday in November, said he could do the labor over weekends, needed only materials, and submitted a handwritten proposal that was 3 paragraphs long. Gabrielle was on the committee that approved it. She didn't tell him this. She showed up the first Saturday morning with 2 coffees, no sugar in his, and sat on the nearby wall while he worked. The second Saturday she brought work gloves and helped level the new bricks. The third Saturday she brought Constance, who was visiting again and who knelt in the soil with neither hesitation nor complaint and planted the 3 rosemary bushes they'd decided on for the south corner. The work was slow. The ground was difficult in places. There were days the weather turned and they stood under the eave and drank bad coffee from the machine inside and laughed about nothing significant for 20 minutes before going back out. Time passed in that particular way it passes when you are doing something patient and physical together, neither slowly nor quickly, but meaningfully. The courtyard took shape over weeks. The brick path lay flat and even. The bench was anchored and repainted a deep green. A small dogwood was planted near the entrance that would bloom in April. They were there one Saturday afternoon in late December, the light already going, the air cold and still, when Marcus stood back and looked at it and she came to stand beside him, the book she'd brought tucked under one arm. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned in. They looked at the thing they'd made together, not saying anything for a long while. It wasn't a scene she planned or that he announced. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January, the bench, the east entrance, the last of the day's light going sideways across the parking lot the way it did in winter. She'd brought Sula, which she was rereading for what she realized was the 4th time. He sat beside her reading something else. After a while she said, "I love you. I wanted you to know." He didn't turn immediately. He closed his book with his thumb holding the place. He looked at the parking lot for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I know," he said. "Then, I love you too. Have for a while." "How long?" He thought about it honestly. "The thing about Morrison," he said. "That conversation. Something about the way you took that in." She looked down at the book in her hands. "That was the second day," she said. "Yes," he said. She let that sit. She didn't make anything large of it. She simply nodded and opened her book again, and he opened his, and they sat there in the cooling air in the particular happiness of 2 people who have finally stopped managing their distance and are simply, plainly, near each other. The proposal happened in the courtyard. April, as planned and not planned. The dogwood had bloomed 3 days before, right on time, the white flowers opening against the brick path they'd laid together. The rosemary in the south corner had come through the winter. The bench, painted green, sat solid and level in the space it had always been meant to occupy. He wasn't on one knee. He was sitting on that bench when she arrived on a Saturday morning with 2 coffees, a habit now, an anchor of their whole particular story. He had the copy of Sule in his hands. Which was strange, because it was her copy, from her apartment, and she hadn't given it to him recently. She stopped. "How did you get that?" "Your mother," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the book out. It fell open to the back cover. Inside the back cover, in his precise handwriting, was a single sentence, "Will you?" And below it, tucked into the fold, a ring that was not large or ostentatious but was exactly, perfectly, her. She took the book in both hands. She stood there in the courtyard they had rebuilt together, surrounded by the things they'd planted, under the blooming dogwood, with the worn cover of a story about time and trust and things that go unexplained between people, and she said yes. She sat down on the green bench beside him. He put his arm around her. The morning light came in clean. "There's something I want to leave you with." Gabrielle built walls because she'd been hurt, and that is human and that is fair. But what she almost missed, what nearly cost her everything, was the difference between protecting yourself and punishing someone for what someone else did. Love, real love, is not the absence of fear. Fear is always there. What matters is what you choose to do next to it. Whether you let the fear make your decisions or whether you say, "I see you, I know you, and I'm going in anyway." Marcus never asked her to be invulnerable. He only asked her to be honest. And when she finally was completely, uncomfortably, all the way in, that honesty became the foundation instead of the threat. Think about the courtyard. Cracked bricks, wobbling bench, ground that didn't cooperate. They didn't tear it all up and start over. They worked with what was there. They were patient. They showed up. That's the whole story. That's all any of it was. The dogwood bloomed because they stayed. I have 2 questions for you today, and I genuinely want to know. First, have you ever tested someone you cared about because you were scared of being hurt, and what happened? And second, do you think Gabrielle was wrong to set up that test, or was it actually the thing that helped her finally see clearly? Drop your answers in the comments, I read every single one. If this story moved you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that love after loss is still possible. Subscribe if you're new here, we tell stories like this every single week. And next time? A man who gives up everything to be near a woman who tells him she'll never love him. What happens when she changes her mind 6 years later? That one is going to stay with you.